Hello and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Garrett Schmidt. I'm the managing editor for VBC Exhibit Hall, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's live panel discussion hosted by the Institute for Advancing Health Value. And it's titled Cultivation of Physician Wellbeing in the Value Journey. And it's dealing with physician wellness and kind of the fourth leg of the triple aim or the quadruple aim stool, which is very, very important, something that's underutilized. It's not talked about a lot. So I'm really excited to hear what these gentlemen have to say today. A few items of note before we get started. All attendees have joined in listen-only mode today. So if you joined us today, you don't need to worry about muting your microphone or turning off your camera. It's not like a Zoom thing. It's a webinar, so you can just watch them. And secondly, we will be having a time for Q&A towards the end, so we would love to hear from you. So any questions that you have for these gentlemen, please ask. There is in your attending module, there's a place for questions. It's not the chat. It's actually a little question module. So if you put your question in there, we're going to get to as many of those as we possibly can during the allotted time today. If we don't get to yours, we'll make sure that someone is going to follow up with you via email. So even if we're just wrapping up towards the very, very end, go ahead and ask your question, but you don't need to wait until Q&A. Go ahead and ask it at any time, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. And then finally, we are recording today's session. So what's going to happen is after the presentation is done, you'll be receiving an email from me probably later on this afternoon or even this evening, and it will contain the link to the recording as well as where you can download. We have a couple slides, not many, because this is more of a discussion format, but there's a couple slides with some announcements and things at the end that you might be interested in. So you'll be able to download theirs as well. And then finally, without further ado, I wanted to introduce very briefly our speakers for today, and they'll give a more thorough introduction of themselves. But in no particular order, Dr. Dyke Drummond, who is the CEO, physician coach, and speaker with thehappymd.com. Dr. Masha Khan, who is associate and advisor, moral injury of healthcare. And Dr. Amadeo Cabral, who is the president of Turning Point Healthcare Consultants. Very excited because Eric Weaver, who's the executive director of the Institute for Advancing Health Value. And I'm very excited because Dr. Cabral and Eric Weaver both serve on our advisory board for the exhibit hall, or vbcexhibithall.com. So excited to have these guys with us. So I'm going to turn it over to Eric at this time, and look forward to hearing you guys talk today. So welcome.
Well, hello, everyone. This is Eric Weaver. It's a great privilege to be with you today, moderating this discussion on the topic of cultivating physician well-being and the part it plays in the value journey. You know, I think a lot about how physicians are on the front lines of healthcare today, and it's almost like they're going to battle every day. It's a metaphor, of course, physicians almost being on the front lines like combat soldiers. And there's just a profound and unrecognized threat to their own well-being, which is what we now call moral injury. And we often hear that frequently mischaracterized. And combat veterans, we know it as post-traumatic stress, but in the physician workforce, it's often portrayed as burnout. And there's an understanding of burnout and moral injury in healthcare and how physicians need to heal in order to provide the best care to patients. And burnout of the physician workforce, it's this constellation of symptoms that include everything from exhaustion and cynicism and decreased productivity. More than half of physicians report at least one of those. And this concept of burnout, it resonates poorly with physicians. It suggests a failure of them, that they're not resourceful or resilient enough. And these are traits that physicians have finally honed over decades and going through intense training and demanding work. I mean, even some of the leading organizations in healthcare like Mayo Clinic report a third of their physicians are experiencing burnout. And this is something that's part of a larger problem, which is just the broken healthcare system. And we have this complex web of providers with highly conflicted allegiances to patients, to their own self, to employers. And its intended moral injury is driving up poor outcomes in the healthcare system. And we're now at a tipping point. And this is the discussion I wanted to have today with our three exceptional thought leaders. How do we come about developing strategies that are going to improve the wellness of our physician workforce. I mean, this has to be something more than just mindfulness, meditation, and relaxation techniques, and cognitive behavior therapy and resilience training. This is really about culture, it's about leadership, and it's about really what is at the heart of value-based care. So in our webinar today, you're going to hear from 3 physician thought leaders about this plight of physician burnout. You have Dr. Moshe Cohn, a board-certified pediatrician. He specializes in pediatric critical care and hospice and palliative care medicine. He's an associate advisor to the Moral Injury of Healthcare, which is an organization that's out there changing the conversation around workforce distress in healthcare. You have Dr. Dyke Drummond, who's a Mayo-trained family practice physician. He's a leading coach, trainer, and consultant. His vision is to realize the quadruple aim in healthcare, and he's the CEO and founder of happymd.com, which provides training to physicians all across the country. And we have Dr. Amadeo Cabral, who's a board certified general surgeon. He's a fellow of the American College of Surgeons. He's an entrepreneur. He's the president and owner of the Quality Surgical Care PA, the Hernia Institute of Florida, and he's also the president of Turning Point Healthcare Consultants. So, gentlemen, I really appreciate your time, your thought leadership today, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Thank you. Likewise. Thank you.
So I thought as we start this conversation, I mean, I kind of framed up the problem for you all, and it's irrefutable at this point. I mean, there's even a recent Medscape survey report that surveyed 13,000 physicians, and 60% of them reported burnout, and a lot of it was resulting from administrative and bureaucratic burdens like charting and paperwork. These physicians reported that they're missing the motivation of having strong patient relationships because of all these administrative burdens. This burnout is causing physician turnover in the tune of $260 million annually. I mean, this is something that is really a problem. And when we had a prep call on this for this webinar, I remember all of you saying in solidarity, this burnout issue we have is a leadership failure. This is an issue where many of our leaders in healthcare organizations, they exist in an echo chamber, and they're creating this culture where it's ingenuine or even psychopathic in terms of them talking about well-being, talking about patients come first, but they're not really demonstrating the leadership actions to create a truly patient-centered care delivery model. So I wanted to start there and get your views on what is actually happening out there on the front lines, if you will, of patient care that's creating this systemic problem.
Well, if I can set a stage, I'd like to take everybody back to when you're physicians, and my understanding is most of the people on the line are not necessarily physicians, most of the attendees here. I want you to know that you're dealing with a very special group of people. And we can call it a workforce if you wish, and we can call healthcare an industry if you wish, but it doesn't do justice to what's happening. So all of us physicians, typically in our early 20s, we're at a choice point, a fork in the road where we could go to medical school or we could basically do anything else. And somehow each of us had a little bit different calling to be a helper and a healer and a light worker. And a yearning to be knee to knee behind a closed door with a patient in the conversations that heal, the conversations that offer support when you can't heal. And anything that gets in the way of that, anything that gets in the way of us just seeing patients breaks our spirit, breaks our heart, and gets in the way of production and profit and everything else that happens when you put it into a business. Burnout is a symptom. Burnout is a symptom of overwhelm in a person who cares about what they do and is blocked in their attempts to be a pure expression of healer, helper, and light worker, which is what we're looking for. So anything else that we talk about today, that's what's underlying it. We just want to see patients. It should be aligned, I would hope. That's what you ought to want us to do too. Because when we're seeing patients from a business perspective, we're generating RVUs and we're dealing with, taking care of folks in a cost-effective manner. And just remember too, burnout is a marker for an impaired physician too. quality, safety, patient satisfaction, turnover, the quality of their life, the quality of their family's life, their very life itself is at risk. So it's a really big deal.
Yeah, I would dovetail that a little bit and bring in what you just said about we're recognizing burnout. And I certainly want to thank you and the Institute and everybody attending for just being a physician in an era now where this is being recognized. It's taken a long time. I think we've recognized it. Perhaps we're recognizing it more now because of the pandemic, but it's been building. But my pitch and the pitch where we look at this at the organization I work with, the moral injury of healthcare, is that language really matters. You know, Dyke and Amedeo we're can all go back to how we spent hours looking in books and, you know, medical dictionaries, just learning the language of medicine, because that's how we communicate with each other. When we're dealing with a patient's lives, we have to use the right words to make sure we're communicating effectively. And that's just as important here. We are dealing with a public health crisis, and the language that we use is critical. So I'm gonna want to take burnout, which Dyke is 100% correct. It's this symptom, but it's also the end stage, like, symptom of what's going on. You mentioned moral injury, Eric, and that's really where a lot of this starts. And I want to just take the opportunity to perhaps define that for the people listening. You mentioned PTSD. It's certainly related, and the terminology does come from experience with military veterans. All over the nursing literature, and finally in 2017, 2018, it popped up in the physician literature. And what it is exactly what Dyke is saying about how we come to work every day for one reason, because we have a moral drive to use our God-given abilities to help people, our brains, our hands, in whatever way we can. It doesn't make us better than anybody else. It just means it's a choice. We made that choice. That's going to be our career, how we're going to spend our time, a lot of our time, especially in the training. And so we show up with that moral drive. We want to help somebody. And then something gets in the way. Sometimes it's purposeful. Rarely, I think, is it purposeful. I don't think anybody listening here, I don't impugn any executive suggest that somebody at the top, a CEO, a manager, administrator, ever has physician well-being as something that's not important, or that patient care isn't important. But they're not necessarily thinking about that moral drive when they show up to work every day. I don't know. I know for myself, and I know and I assume that that's the case for my colleagues, my physician colleagues, my nursing colleagues. When there's an obstacle to that moral drive, to that mission, then we are injured. There's something about us, inside us, that is injured. And when it happens over and over and over again, we are beaten down and we start questioning whether we want to do it anymore. And for many of us, I can certainly speak for myself, when we start noticing that, when we start noticing, hey, I don't want to come in. I don't want to see my patients who I've cared about for a really long time. And that's how I've identified my being and how I live my life, then something's wrong. And so that repeated moral injury ultimately leads to what we generally call burnout. The crazy part is, and this is how I think I ultimately want to frame it. When we talk about, I think we've talked about burnout in other industries. Usually we're talking about a workplace problem. It's a toxic environment, a mean boss, coworkers who you just don't get along with, you don't have resources, things about the job, and that you keep putting effort into and it just isn't working out. And maybe you spent a lot of time and finally you put all that effort and it just crashes. You've burned out and you got to do something else. You can get to burnout from many directions, but the workplace environment is usually the most common. For us, though, getting to burnout means we've been injured over and over and over again by someone or something or some system saying to us, well, we're sorry you want to care for your patient that way, but we're not going to let you. The system doesn't allow for it. There's a checkbox that wasn't completed, and therefore your patient can't get the medication they need, the rehab they need, the nursing care they need, the physicians they need. If we experience that over and over again, then we're burned out, not from a job, we're burned out from this mission. So that's the starting point for me. And I think it's important that anybody who's interested in this, in working on this, on the leadership side, start there rather than on the business end. This is the table. This is the table we're setting here where we have to start talking.
And I'd love to hear your views as well, Dr. Cabral. What can leadership do to really ameliorate the suffering that's happening in the physician workforce?
Thank you. And once again, it's a pleasure being here. And I echo the sentiments from Dyke and Motion. We have to first fundamentally realize that, when people talk about a public health emergency, they tend to think of something explosive that happens overnight. So for example, the pandemic is a great example of this. But this physician burnout, this provider burnout, is the classic slow boiling pot of water. And until it gets to that breaking point, which then it's a complete breaking point, the whole system looks to plug and play. It's to commoditize all us providers because some few people, quote unquote, can't handle it. But the reality of this problem is severe, and we're getting more and more literature, even just out of the oven. The New York Times published an article. It was a 10-year research. You're talking about 60%, 2 out of 3 physicians. The advisor board did about 170 observational studies recently published. Again, 2 and 3. There is, fundamentally speaking, and to Dyke's point as well, is that there's this incongruence between the business of medicine, that is the incentives of the healthcare system or healthcare organization, versus the incentives of the physician to do their work, to take care of their patients, and to establish a relationship. And so we have competing incentives right now. And unfortunately, when we talk about a broken health system that's $4 trillion, it's not a broken business model. It's a broken healthcare model. And what's the leadership right now is the business model. So the business model is taking the leadership position. And I think what's imperative is that the physicians have to be at the table. We can no longer be part of the menu. We have to be at the table, and we have to find a way to gather some congruency, which was everything that Moshe spoke about, as well as Dyke, and at the same time to have a system that survives. And I think that's the key thing. How do we get these incentives to merge?
Well, I wanted to stay on this topic, gentlemen, on the state of our broken system. I mean, clearly fee-for-service healthcare has destroyed the physician-patient relationship. It's depersonalized care delivery. I mean, we now see that patient encounters are often looked at as transactions and patients often as ATM machines, instead of having true opportunities to forge long-term healing relationships. And, it's so different than the old Marcus Welby days of delivering holistic, patient-centered healthcare. And consequently, we have this inexorably broken healthcare system that is delivering bad cost and quality outcomes. We've seen primary care marginalized because of how lucrative it is to have high cost specialists and proceduralists that are just generating volume and RVUs. And it's almost like we have this perfect storm of physician burnout and moral injury, and the suffering in the physician workforce. I see it as the canary in the coal mine. It's a symptom of a more systemic problem. And it's tragic that we're now seeing data that shows that physicians are killing themselves twice that of active duty military members. And I mean, it's clearly signaling that something is wrong with the overall system. So I think about the work that many of us on this call do in value-based care. The IHI and Don Berwick coined this term called the triple aim, which is really about defining value-based care in terms of lower per capita costs, better patient experience, higher quality outcomes. And then consequently, since the inception of that model, many are saying, we need a quadruple aim. We need to really look at physician satisfaction as an important aspect of value-based care.
Well, if I can just correct the record here, Don Berwick brought out the quadruple aim as an apology for the triple aim. It just has failed.
I didn't know that.
It's an apology.
Well, let's talk about this quadruple aim. I mean, how do you define value-based care? Because we see all this confusion in the marketplace. Many are thinking of value-based care strictly in terms of payment models and aligning incentives. Patients are confused. They don't know what the heck it is. They think it's a Big Mac, in terms of value. Like they think higher cost is better quality. So how would you define value-based care, and where does this concept of physician wellness fit within that construct?
Well, it's so funny. Go ahead.
No, it's so funny because, again, the whole value-based care, right, which has become also another euphemism for another business model, where the true value-based care is a wellness model. So it goes against the sickness model, the CPT code model. It's a DRG model, the value-based. It's taking care of diseases and trying to keep people out of the hospital. It's trying to keep people at home. Is trying to minimize the overuse of specialists, like we've seen in my past as a chief strategy officer in ACO, where you have specialists seeing patients 10 times more than the primary care physician in 1 year, where data has clearly showed that they do not do better. In fact, more stuff gets done to the patient, and the outcomes are worse. And when it comes to the physician, then it became a procedural thing. It became, if you check all these blanks or you cross all these T's, you're going to get paid 2% more of your fees. So now it became, let's make sure, forget about Mrs. Jones. Let's make sure that all those T's are crossed, all those I's are dotted, and that's not value. That's just another business model. True value-based care is population health management, is a wellness model.
Yeah, right before we started today, I was just jotting down a few things. One of which was, how are we defining value? Who set that? Who makes that definition? The triple aim. So you can just start there before we even get to physician well-being, because I think making it a quadruple aim actually does a disservice to physicians. The physician well-being should be a given. If you don't have that, forget about an aim. If it's a problem, it has to be fixed before any of the other things are going to work. But going back to the triple aim, if you can remind Eric, what it was right, patient experience,
cost,
and cost,
quality.
And outcome, right, and quality, right. So now patient experience, in theory, is measurable somehow. I don't want to get into the issues there in terms of how that affects physician well-being. There are issues there, but let's say there's a way we can provide a good experience. We know that, and there are good advertisers, business models where you can give people a good experience. Cost, well, that can be addressed too, somewhat objectively. And in fact, our entire cost model for healthcare is fairly arbitrary, right? If I want to buy a television and I go to PC Richards versus Best Buy, I can probably get the same TV for within a couple of $100 difference in price, depending on who's having a sale. But why does a knee replacement cost $50,000 in one hospital and down the street costs $100,000? That doesn't sound like a normal way of doing business. So cost is something that could clearly be addressed by whoever it is, the people behind the curtain that decide what that is. But as a physician, the only thing we really care about is those outcomes. And for as long as most of us can remember, certainly our training and the decades that led up to our training, those outcomes meant that we ended our day with a patient feeling better than they did when they woke up in the morning. They came to see us, where either our office or our hospital, and we did something to help them, and that's the outcome we're looking for. Or it's something that affected their lives. Maybe it's a week later, a month, a year, 5 years later, we did something to intervene to help them, or we did some preventive work. We said, hey, change your diet, exercise, and find a way to connect with them. We have to have that connection in order for those things to work, certainly. So those outcomes were the things that we were aiming for, and yet somewhere along the way, someone else decided what those outcomes should be. And those outcomes ended up being, well, did we check the box of the guideline that was created around a CPT code, that was created around a diagnosis, not around a person? And so that aim, what's built in there is, well, how do we get to those outcomes? We need to be okay to get to those outcomes. So I turn that around to, what does value really mean? If you ask us what value means, you're going to get one answer. If you ask healthcare leadership and administrators, I think you get a very different answer. Again, we're not speaking the same language.
Well, and I would say it's important to acknowledge that you don't want to turn super tankers if you don't have to. So I'm dealing with burned out doctors every day who call us on the internet for acute support. And so we need to be able to help them right away. And so one of the things I know is that since most of them are employees, what we have to do is help them carve out a place for a more rewarding practice within the reality of the business model where they live. So the word value right now simply is a business side buzzword to talk about capitation. And let's just talk about the fact that capitation actually produces a healthier workplace and could potentially produce better outcomes, because you don't have to spin the fee-for-service wheel to make the money that you need inside a capitated system. It's paid at the first of the month, and most capitated systems that I've dealt with have higher numbers of people in the front lines of actual primary care offices. So they will upstaff with pharmacy and social work and therapists and all that kind of stuff in the front end. And for the physician, the day, typically an ordinary family doc goes from 28, 30 patients a day, fee for service, fast as you can, with somebody always pushing you in the back, goes down to more like what you would see in a concierge practice, right? It would be like 10 or 12 or 15 people, and you go a little deeper and a little wider. So potentially it makes for a better experience for the physician. But what ends up happening is, I see over and over again, people who practice what they call high value care stop there and say, we're a better business model, it's healthier for the doctors, and they start spouting quadruple aim. By the way, anytime anybody says quadruple aim, except on this conversation, it's a marketing ploy and it's complete horsepucky. So just forget about it. It's always a tech company. They want a robot doctor. They don't want to have to deal with this. But let me just make it really clear. The business side of the organization enforces the fundamentals of the business model. If you're a manager, you're trying to squeeze a square doctor into a round hole. You have to, I believe, ethically, if you're working in healthcare as a non-clinician, if you're not seeing patients, but you've chosen to work in healthcare, you must have some respect for the healing encounter. How do I know that you are concerned about the doctors and the nurses and the techs and the patients and the things that go on behind closed door? It's really easy to tell. Do you shadow your providers or not? Do you shadow your providers or not? And I have been around the country in front of thousands and thousands of doctors all around the world. And I've said to the leaders of the organizations, raise your hand if you regularly shadow your doctors. In a room of 100, I might get 2. That is the breakdown. Because if in your heart, building a better practice, taking better care of patients, which in either revenue model is supported by making more money. If in your heart you cared about that, if you shadow just once, you'll be appalled, chagrined. You know, you're going to want to put a gun to your head about how many obstructions that you put in the way of your people offering quality care and making the kind of money that you're asking them for. But nobody shadows. That's what we mean by a leadership failure. So we can call it value-based care, upstaff the front office, do primary care. Absolutely. Pay more time and attention to the folks that have more comorbidities. Absolutely. We are with you. Just get all of the other stuff out of our way. Let's go.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say, you know, pay our pediatricians better, self-serving. But you know, just from the perspective, and I only thought about this when I was a few years into practice, right? But what's the measure of how much we care about our children in this country, right? It's how much we're willing to invest.
Right.
So what are we investing in education in this country? What are we investing in mental health? And what are we investing in medical health? Pediatricians, the lowest paid physicians in the country. I'm not saying that because I'm asking for more money, but because it's simply a reflection of how the child with pneumonia, that the care for that child is reimbursed at an unbelievably lower level than an adult with pneumonia. Why that should be, I still haven't figured out. If someone would care to explain it to me, I'm all ears. But it's just, again, it's emblematic of what do we care about? Why are we here?
It's so amazing how inverted those values are, that when you go to true systems of medicine in other countries, which can get criticized here for ideological perspectives, but not for outcomes. That's what's amazing. You can how it's more inverted, right? How pediatricians, family practice, internal medicine are in the lower part. And that's why you don't see those billboards on the highway, right? It's all about MSK, and it's all about cardiovascular and all the things that generate not just that initial service, but expansive profit-making, secondary and tertiary services that spawn from it. But that's our fee-for-service model, But my kid gets sick, and the pediatrician is God. I run. My wife says, "What do you think we should do?" I said, "We should go to the pediatrician." And that's the true measure of the value of a provider. And I've seen other very high level executives run just as fast as I do to the pediatrician when that's the time to come. The other part of the scale and value that I think we need to look at a lot is these last 6 months of life. And I think that causes also a tremendous burden on physicians when they have the inability to be able to sit and talk with the patient and the family member and ask them, did you really want all this done? Do you really want all these ER admissions? Do you really want all these interventions? Well, they make a lot of money, so they don't want you to talk about that either. And then you have this percentage of patients with a terrible end of life, terrible quality of life for their family members. And I've seen a lot of physicians really burn out when they're dealing with this group of population, because they know that the end is inevitable. But now they're caught in the middle of this tug of war. So you got both sides of the spectrum. You got the child care, and then you got the elderly care at the end. And those are causes of just significant stress on the system, and specifically on the providers, where nurses look at you and say, what are we doing here? Why?
Well, it's classically American and classically built on a multi-payer fee-for-service system. So I have some people in my community that are hospital at home outpatient internists in Ireland. And Ireland has little tiny hospitals that are difficult to get to, and they don't have very many beds, because when you get triaged in Ireland, what's the first decision they have to make? Hospice, or are we actually going to care for you?
Mm-hmm.
And they make the decision. No, you don't have something we can fix. You're going home on hospice. And then when they say, okay, you have something we're going to treat, are you in septic shock? No, you're going home. And we're going to treat you at home because we have comprehensive outpatient services, right? So if you apply those principles of value-based care to the American healthcare system, 80% of our hospital beds go away. And I'll say confidently, if we could run that experiment, right, 80% of the hospital beds in America are unnecessary if we granted our society the ability to answer the questions about what is and is not a reasonable investment in quality of life.
We've created a system where much like in the fast food industry, right? You want it and you want it now, and you want to make it happen. And the physicians and nurses and healthcare workers are the ones making that happen. And then above us are the business leaders and executives who are creating some kind of framework that facilitates that. But the reality is that we then end up stuck into a system that was created by advertising diseases, some of which exist, some of which don't, by advertising procedures, some of which may be better than what the gold standard used to be, maybe not. We could talk for days about open versus laparoscopic appendectomies and all what's gone back and forth with stuff like that. So what's so great about this country, right, is that we have hope for everything. We have hope that something's going to get better, whether we make it better with technology, we make it better with discovery and innovation, and that's what our competitive nature breeds. But that doesn't mean that we can fix everything, and it doesn't mean that just because we have something shiny and new, we should just sell it if it's not going to help the patients. And the more we layer that on, the more we add those things, we've completely forgotten why we did it to begin with.
I just want to pinch your cheeks. You're so cute. It's like, just because we can make money, we shouldn't sell it. Like, who's going to agree with that? This is America, man.
Well, gentlemen,
you don't have to work for them, but somebody's going to sell it for money.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Dyke, you were talking about the need to respect the healing encounter, and the best thing that leaders could do is to shadow the physician.
Absolutely.
And understand. So I wanted to get back to what we were talking about earlier, and I don't think, Moshe, you wanted to go there, but I'll take us there. This check the box system that we currently have, and let's just look at the triple aim, for example. One of those key performance indicators is patient experience, and it has one meaning for executives and one meaning for physicians. Physicians live it, they value the relationship. Executives want the score. And I'm just thinking about, how can you expect physicians to have a 5-star rating with their patients on experience when the doctor only rates their experience as a 2-star? I mean, I'm just thinking about, like, what patients value isn't what executives value in the experience. Executives are thinking about the environment of care in terms of having good Wi-Fi and waterfalls and marble floors and convenience, and patients are thinking about, I want relationship.
Not for profit has waterfalls, not for profit.
Right.
Uh-huh.
I do want to say something, Eric, regarding the patient experience, because I think patient experience as well as quality measures have been weaponized against the provider, and have been one of the main triggers to physician burnout outside of the EHR and now the pandemic. Patient it's a conflict of interest, patient satisfaction. When you sit down with the patient who demands antibiotics for a viral cold, and you spend 15 minutes explaining to them that this is not a bacteria, that antibiotics are not required. In fact, they can have adverse effects. And then the patient walks out and says, well, I'll go to someone else because that's what I want. And when they get their evaluation form of that physician, he gets a 3-star for practicing good medicine. Because and this is just a small example. The quality measures example of how it's weaponized, and I've seen it, is one of the things that got me out of big health systems is when I would be in meetings and 30% of the members in that meeting were physicians working 12 hours a day. And then the other, 70% were holding clipboards and telling doctors they're not checking those boxes. The quality measures have to translate in actual quality outcomes. And a lot of quality measures we've known have no impact on outcome and cost. They were nice and shiny and they were put there and we say we did this and we checked that and everything like that. So then they're weaponized against the provider because, well, that's my job. My job is to hold the clipboard, and Dr. Drummond, I'm sorry, You only filled out, even though you worked 12 hours a day for the past 5 days, 80% of these boxes. Your patients were happy. You practiced good medicine. You did not prescribe antibiotics when you shouldn't have. But boy, you're not doing a good job, Dr. Drummond. Boy, that is just another weapon just to further attack the physician. And what you have now is the majority of us are compliant, not committed.
Yeah.
And there's a big difference between compliance, and compliance can go to several levels, from begrudgingly to whatever they want. They want this sign it. That's
Zombie.
That's not patient.
Amadeo, I want to. It reminds me of something, and I don't think I shared this with you guys on our prep call. It's the kind of thing that when you do it enough, and I'm only a little younger than the two of you, and I was trained in a transition period where in medical school I was taught how to really write a good note, a good story about my patient, to make sure that I'm communicating effectively the things that I saw, the important parts of the patient's life and illness. And then transitioned into postgraduate training, residency, and fellowships, where we were really heavily on checkboxes and EMRs. And it becomes ingrained in you when, I got to make sure I got my note in on time. I got to make sure. Why? I don't really know why. I just know someone's going to yell at me if I don't. A few years ago, I took care of a little girl who unfortunately suffered a catastrophic brain bleed. And I knew that she wasn't going to survive. I took care of her for all of 8 hours from the time she got to the hospital until she passed. I stayed, this was in the middle of the night, so I stayed to make sure I spoke to the parents and then to speak with the staff once everything was sort of settled down and quieter, to make sure the staff was okay, the nurses, the respiratory therapists, anybody involved in the care of that child. And at around 2 a.m, I was ready to take my bag and go home. And this instinct, this habit, I'm going to say, but I instantly went to the computer and sat down to write my notes, because I was afraid, and I knew that if I didn't write them down right then and there, someone was going to yell at me the next day. And just realizing that was just it was very painful. That's exactly the end result of this moral injury, of what Dr. Cabral is talking about. I mean, to check that box, was that the important thing at that time? Right? Normally, we write things down so we can communicate to other physicians, perhaps to non-clinicians, and to patients themselves these days. But in this case, it was simply a box to check, and yet I was afraid that someone was going to, sanction me or criticize me or whatever for not having done that. That's where we are.
Yeah, patient satisfaction, and I've written about this, should never be 100% unless you're a criminal physician. You'll give anything to anybody, and pretty soon they're going to be paying you for that, because people will get a reputation for giving anything to everybody. So I'm not joking when I say that. Patient satisfaction is related to your ability to be fully present with your patient, to sit down, take a breath, look them in the eye, push the computer off to the side, and be there. The first thing that flies out of the way when you're overstressed and burned out. I challenge anybody who thinks they're on the value journey, or ever uses the word value in any C-suite discussion or any discussion with doctors, to go all the way. Go beyond the business model. Build a culture of support, and always be shadowing your providers and wringing the stress out of the systems of care. Do it. Take it all the way. There should be a significant corporate proactive burnout prevention strategy to go with your value-based revenue model. And then last, any of you that have value-based contracts. So for instance, if I'm a doctor and our organization accepts 20 payers, and 2 of these payers have capitated contracts, but the rest don't, you're not going to get your doctors to change their behavior. What you want to do is create a pilot. Well, 100% of the patients that come to this doctor are paid for by capitation. It's all within a consistent ecosystem. If you do your pilots on a mixed payer setup, you'll never see the behavior that you want out of the doctors, because it's not. It can't be congruent. So when I go to things like America's physician groups and other groups that are on so-called value journey and have a blended payer mix, and by the way, this is why quality in America is such a bugaboo. It's been weaponized. It's not that the government is the single payer and they have one quality indicator you have to comply with. Your business office accepts 60 payers and they've got 60 different ones you have to comply with. That's America for you right there. And by the way, our healthcare system in terms of outcares is abysmal. There's no other first world country that would put up with 2 years in a row life expectancy in the United States going down, bottom in the first world in every measure you want to look at. It's crazy.
And add to that, Dyke, if you look at G20, and we did mention this in our prelim talk, you look at of the $4 trillion administrative, okay, the whole slice of administrative is over 30%.
Right.
The closest countries are 9 to 10% of their global healthcare budget, and for worse outcomes. Okay, and if you look at, for example, growth in non-clinical jobs from the 1970s versus providers, it's 200% for providers, is 3,500% for non-clinical provider. And by the way, that line goes with the health expenditure line. It's the same. It's the same
Right.
slope.
Right.
That's a great statistic. Yeah.
I mean,
it's
everybody
amazing.
needs to make sure they're adding value. Everybody needs to make sure they're adding value in terms of more and better outcomes.
Well, I wanted to stay on this topic of culture. I'm going to address some audience questions. We have a couple of them, and we have one in particular that really dovetails quite nicely into this topic. So we've talked a lot about leadership in the traditional administrative executive role, but I want to talk about physician leadership and where we are with the current challenges of shifting the paradigm. For physician leadership to really lead us into a new era, it's almost like we have to overcome some of the conditioning that takes place in the medical profession, where instead of being a cowboy, where it's autocratic, it's my way or the highway almost, we have to deconstruct the delivery paradigm where you're thinking about the model of the team, and it's interdependent, it's interconnected. You disperse leadership, you have a decentralized power structure. You're really thinking more about physicians being a quarterback, where you're facilitating handoffs and team-based care. And we had a great question in the chat about team-based care, and I wanted to ask you just where, in terms that dispersion of leadership and having more of a team-based approach to patient-centered care models, where that fits into the physician wellness side of the equation.
So just remember real quickly that our medical school curriculum is over 100 years old. Talk about a monolithic structure where exactly we're competing against each other from the beginning till residency. It's the most individualistic system of training there is. Sometimes I've had friends who were in systems where there were no friendships. I mean, that's terrible. So our ultra competitive, ultra individualistic upbringing in the medical field in this country is pervasive. So that's a big problem.
Sorry, I would just
yes.
modify that slightly. As someone, I've been teaching in medical schools for the past 10 years. And what's even worse is that there are some schools that are trying, right, to change that model, whether it's by having courses on empathy and ethics and expanding the approach to a wider or more holistic model, including team-based care. But then what happens? They graduate. You're smiling, I know, right? You graduate and you're dumped into the system that completely deprioritizes that motivation to provide that holistic care,
Great.
to really work as a team. And so as a physician, we are siloed within our own medical staff offices. The nurses are siloed with their own staffing admins, the respiratory therapists, physical therapists, all the various clinicians. We're all separated from one another. We are never at the table together to actually talk about how to do what you're talking about, Eric. The one exception I would say that I've experienced is in high quality palliative care, where it's actually required for us to have a team of people like that. But many hospitals don't even have the staffing to provide those teams. In pediatrics, I think it happens a little bit more so, I think, than in adult medicine. I think perforce. It takes a village beyond the village with pediatric care, but by and large, the system is just not built for that. No matter how much we might, fix education, which we need to do, but if the system isn't geared toward it, that's its own problem.
Well, let me just say to the people who are not doctors, no doctor in med school or residency ever takes a leadership class. We don't learn how to do this. We absorb it through osmosis. And we all agree, us having to make the diagnosis and nobody can move until I give them orders and then they can only do what I tell them to is a terrible, terrible leadership model. But the bigger challenge occurs upstream. The bigger challenge is administrators don't ask. They impose systems. I mean, quality initiatives. There's not administrators saying, there's not doctors saying what to measure. It's coming straight through from the payers. And as far as team-based health goes, let's just stop for a second because we solved burnout. TeamCareMedicine.com, Jim Jerzak at Beelan Health, Corey Lyon at the Apex program at the University of Colorado have upstaffed the outpatient office environment and eliminated burnout and turnover and improved quality and patient satisfaction. What did they do? They defied the MGMA staffing averages, which are actually a cause of burnout, not a best practice. And they put 2.5 to 3.5 scribing MAs in the back office with every single physician. All your problems go away. And you make more money. This has been solved. This has been solved. What stops it is your CFO looks at the fact that you have to hire more MAs and says no, because the CFO has never shadowed a doctor. So it's all kind of crazy, but let me say that again. TeamCareMedicine.com. Go look at their flow diagrams. Jim Jerzak, Jerzak, Beelan, Bellin Health in Wisconsin. And Corey, Corey, Lyon, Lyon, University of Colorado, Apex programs. It was published in the American Family Practice literature. It's all there. You don't have to do anything except implement those in your outpatient clinics and team-based geographic rounding on your hospitalist services. You make almost all of this go away.
Well, I am
Oh,
okay.
Full support, of team-based care. Full supporter also as well. And the only thing I want to add about the leadership question, because I've had that situation in my life and see the effects it has. When you are a practicing physician and you realize that you need to be more involved in leadership decisions, and now you have to cross the schism, right? You go to the other side. You're talking about two worlds that are working in parallel. One of the most difficult things for physicians who have tried and those that have succeeded is trying to balance your practice and do leadership endeavors and try to help out and be involved, because you have one foot in one canoe and another foot in another canoe. And of course, when they call you for a meeting, and this happened to me all the time, it would be the day before. I have a full office. Oh, by the way, at 10 o'clock, we're going to have a meeting about, the next quality measures and the next, that's the middle of my office. So do I cancel all my patients? Or can we try to find ways to include the docs at times when it's more appropriate for them, even though the non-docs have to maybe stay a little later? Because we do that a lot.
Or how about when you've been in the ICU for 24 hours and you're post call and they say, oh, we need you to attend a department meeting at 9 a.m. after I should have been home and in bed.
Oh, and you're not paid either, and not given protected time.
Correct.
Nope.
Well, correct. So leadership in healthcare too is we're against a rock and a hard place to try to even to get into leadership positions unless we decide to just forfeit our practice, forfeit everything we did, and then just do administrative. And then it's what's called we jump on the other side. Then what do? You lose complete contact to the people you're actually having to take care of and do what's best for them.
What's amazing is, Dyke, you sort of put this so well, right? We are the number one resource that that this country has in terms of healthcare, right, is your frontline healthcare workers, the people at the bedside. And from a business model, you would think that's what you would want to invest in. And yet somehow that hasn't happened at all. I mean, forget not at all. In fact, it's been beaten down. You know, weaponizing all of the things we've talked about. I would suggest anybody here take a look at the New York Times. Danielle Ofri, who's a internist at NYU and Bellevue Hospital in New York, has written a lot about this. But one of the most important pieces I've seen is when she basically says, healthcare leadership is taking us for granted. Doctors and nurses are being taken for granted.
It's dependent upon exploitation of the doctors. That's the headline of the
Dependent
story.
of the
Right. And it's not malicious. I don't mean to say that anyone out there is, means ill towards us, but the bottom line is we will never abandon our patients. That resource, can you imagine, take advantage of the fact that we won't abandon them. So we need to use that in a way to provide all the things you're talking about. And it not only should it not cost what it's costing us, but it should cost a hell of a lot less.
At some point, all of us are placed in a situation where we have to make a decision. Should I go the extra mile, even though it's unhealthy for me and my family, for this patient, despite the fact that everything about this organization is getting in my way? Should I put in the extra work? And by the way, while we're talking about top of license, you know how you can tell a doctor's not working at the top of their license? They're touching one of these or one of these. Jim Jerzak quote from Beal and Health: everything gets so much better when you can keep the doctors out of the chart.
Well, gentlemen, it's been a great discussion, and I want to continue this conversation in a series of discussions. And we had talked about that initially because this is simply too big of an issue to scratch the surface. And one of the insights that I had when we initially were preparing for this call, I had used the word solution. We need to come up with a solution for this. And you corrected me all of you said, no, this is a strategy. So I thought, before we go into the conclusion, comments, and everything and wrap things up, can you give me like maybe one to be continued like strategy discussion that we could have as we look to maybe do another podcast on this topic or webinar?
The simplest way to prevent burnout is a pair of strategies operating in parallel and simultaneously. Every one of the people who draws a paycheck from your organization must have their own personal canary burnout prevention strategy. And the organization must have a proactive coal mine strategy to wring stress out of the system and build a more supportive culture at the level of the organization.
Yeah, Dyke, I also loved what you said about any administrator who makes decisions that affect frontline workers should be absolutely required to shadow them. I mean, think about what we do. We shadow each other when we train. We shadow each other because we have to learn from each other. But in doing so, we also gain respect for each other. My own one line there would be, stop blaming the physicians and the nurses. Stop blaming healthcare workers for their quote unquote lack of resilience. We are the most resilient people out there. This is beyond.
You have no right to blame us for anything or even point out what we might do different if you've never shadowed us.
I think, of the many things we saw with COVID, and that could be 6 hours of conversation, for people in our country to realize that essential workers, nurses, teachers, the people that do housekeeping, that the providers, all of a sudden epiphany, oh, these people are really important. It took a pandemic. For us to reset our values. And I think what we have to do in healthcare organizations is we have to reset our values. And I think it's been explained here that it can be done and it still can be profitable.
Well, that's a great way to, I think, conclude our conversation today. Gentlemen, I wanted to thank you all for sharing your insights. Appreciate all the work you're doing to really make a better industry for all of us and most importantly, our patients. as we conclude today's discussion, Garrett, I invite you to discuss a little bit about value-based care exhibit hall and the virtual booth and everything going on with VBC exhibit hall.
Yeah, for sure, guys. And this was a fantastic conversation. I could have listened. I know you could have gone all day, and I could have listened to it all day. I think it was fascinating and very, very timely. And one real quick plug, I'm going to put you guys on blast while I've got you in front of this audience here, is maybe we could have a kind of a follow-on discussion that handles the audience questions directly. Because I know we had a ton of questions that came in and we weren't really able to, we didn't have the time to get to those. So maybe we could do some sort of follow-up where we just talk about those things directly, if you guys would like to do that. I know that it would be wonderful. As we conclude, awesome guys, as we conclude, and I want to be sensitive to everyone's time, I want to encourage you to visit the Institute for Advancing Health Values virtual exhibit booth at vbcexhibithall.com. You know, we are a resource for all things value-based care. We try to provide a lot of resources for provider groups and physicians and pretty much anyone that's interested in value-based care. But you can go there and find a lot of different connections and resources. But one of those things is the booth, the exhibit booth for the Institute. So hope that you will visit us there. And then I think we've got a couple quick announcements before we close it up. And I think I'm going to turn it back over to Eric for that.
Well, the Institute for Advancing Health Value, that's the organization to which I lead. We're putting on a free virtual event. It's called Population Health Equity, the North Star for Value. We're going to be spending an entire day looking at policy level decisions, care delivery redesign, reporting and analytics, removing implicit bias from AI algorithms, payer-provider collaborations. We have some excellent keynote speakers. You see two of them on the screen, and Dr. Dora Hughes and Dr. Nwando. I encourage you all to attend that event on December 1st. The Institute for Advancing Health Value, we're a peer learning ecosystem that provides opportunities for networking and ideation and sharing of best practices. We have a free complimentary membership for all provider organizations out there, so ACOs, risk-bearing entities, health systems, practices. We welcome you in open arms, and we look forward to seeing you in future programs that we put on to support the industry as it advances towards value-based care. Well, thank you both. Thank you, everyone that's been a part of today's program, and for all of you attending. We hope you were able to get some great insights, and we will definitely be continuing this conversation as it is so important in the future of our industry.
Great. Thank you all for coming. Have a wonderful rest of your days.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right, guys. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Must have to hit that little tiny X.